Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to the Finding You podcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, December 3rd, 2024. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about a very simple topic, regression. When and why does it happen? And I think before I get into it, the thing I want to say is if you don't recognize regression in your life, if you don't experience it or observe it in your life, that means that it is more insidious. It's going to do more damage to you, to your relationships, to everybody. So part of tonight is just a welcome and an invitation to understand that everybody regresses. I think so much of the what I see from people who do this work is this idea of getting better and better and being good and getting it right. It's so exciting to get the new insights, the new healing, the new awareness, the new powerful emotional epiphanies that we come up. Those are wonderful, exciting parts of this process. But one important thing is to remain grounded and to see that all of us, when exposed to old situations, old contexts, old relationships, old energies, are prone to regression, are prone to going back to an earlier state of awareness, an earlier state of our development and evolution. So before I get more farther into that, I just want to talk about the one thing tonight, talk about our programming coming up. January 15th through 19th is our next Finding You. If you're not signed up, take advantage of it now. It's going to be run by Emma Reedy June. It is a fantastic opportunity to start off the new year, to get settled with that. January 24th through 26th is our next online program. The biggest event coming up that to sign up for is the Conscious Parenting Workshop for all of you. January 10th, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Mountain Time, I'm going to be hosting an all-day workshop on conscious parenting, conscious relationships. So this is an opportunity to go beyond just the lecture, the podcast, the listening, but it's interactive. Each of the two sessions, the first half of the day and the second half of the day, we'll start off with a lecture. Then we'll go into question and answer and vignettes, role plays, questions, and then we'll have some small breakout sessions and process after that. So Conscious Parenting Workshop all day, January 10th, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. with an hour for lunch. And then, of course, the Attachment-Based Therapy Masterclass that I'm teaching March 7th, 9 a.m. to 4 Mountain Time. Contact us anytime you want to get a hold of us, ask about programming, give us suggestions about the podcast, any feedback, any requests for the slides that I use during the live broadcast. You can direct all of your inquiries and feedback to info@findingyouprograms.com. That's info@findingyouprograms.com. With that, let's get into regression this evening. I wrote to start off, when you think of relapse or regression, who comes to mind? As a parent educator, which has been largely my focus for 25 years, I find that when I ask parents this question, they naturally go to think about their child or to think about somebody else in their life. Tonight's invitation is to look and be aware of our own regression. If it's your child, your spouse, your friend, your loved one that you think of first, you are for sure neglecting an important part of your responsibility. I share this next quote very often, one of my favorite lighthearted quotes, and with so much truth into it. And I'm going to share the longer version of it tonight. The Guru Ram Dass said, "You've silenced your inner critic, tamed your temper, and you're sure nothing can rattle you anymore. Then the universe presents the ultimate litmus test for your spiritual and personal progress, a week with your family." We thought about doing this topic in the middle of the holiday season, and I can bet if you're paying attention, you can see the themes of these broadcasts are all around visits and gratitude and gift giving. The next broadcast will be about self-care as a form of gift giving. This idea, though, of gathering with family and what it does to us is profound. I remember in treating adolescent young men, for the most part, for 20 years, that they would often say to me, I get along with my friends. I get along with almost everybody except for my family. And I would say to them, but really, that's the only real measure or the most important measure of getting along with people. I would say if you can't get along with your friends at this point, at this age, you're probably really crazy, because you can always walk away from friends, right? You remember when you were a little kid and you would spend extra time with that close friend, maybe on a family trip or some kind of sleepover, and you would find yourself just getting annoyed and triggered so easily. Family are the people, the context that can't escape you. And tonight, I want to talk about this idea that I asked my therapist this question many years ago. I was preparing for a big conference and a talk that I would be giving. I hadn't picked the topic yet, and I asked her, if you could speak, if you were given a blank check to choose your topic, what would be your speech? This is probably about 10 years ago. And she said, I would talk about contexts. It was shortly before she wrote the book on contexts. She said, I would talk about context because I think people underestimate the power of the context. Understanding our context helps us understand ourselves. Looking back at our context from a different context dramatically, vividly exposes our context to us. It helps us to understand, illuminates it for us. Part of the idea of being in psychotherapy or even coming to one of our intensives is to get out of your context, because that's the only position that you can see it clearly. If you're in it, you can't see the forest for the trees. And the way human beings are built is in the context of their context, is to be understood in their context. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, in one of his beautiful quotes, says, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we would see in each man's story suffering sufficient to disarm all hostility. Every behavior, everything that we do is rational if we can track it back to that story and our interpretation of that story. And in a way, psychotherapy is the discovery of our context. And when we understand that context, we are absolutely more compassionate, more empathic, more understanding of ourselves and others. And as I've talked about lately, self-compassion is the key. It's the key to relationship improvement. It's the key to parenting. It's the key to partnership and romantic relationship. Self-compassion is critical, because if we don't have self-compassion, if we're still struggling significantly with shame and guilt and self-punishment and self-criticism, then we're not going to see those parts of ourselves that are real, that are true, that are the parts of ourselves that we have told ourselves or been taught more accurately to hate, to dislike about ourselves. So understanding context. Now, when we leave our context, a lot of American culture with a focus on individualism in our country, in our society, is often marked by this going away from context. But the fact of the matter, going away, leaving your family of origin, leaving home, going far away. And that can be an important journey for sure. And it can give us, again, it can give us a sense of where we came from. But it doesn't solve the context problem, because we carry the context with us. When I hear people talk about self-criticism or limiting beliefs, when I hear them describe their shame to me vividly and articulately, what I will often say to them is, you weren't born with those ideas. And although it is our experience that they come from us, right? We have the experience that what we think, the stories in us, are generated from us. We don't have experience before psychotherapy in understanding and seeing how our context shaped us. And so the context shapes you. You adapt, you fit, you become a certain size or a certain shape. And then you go out in the world for where you fit. A very simple example, if parents spend a lot of time telling children how they feel about the child, I'm upset, I'm disappointed, I'm angry, I'm proud, I'm happy, I'm pleased. If those messages, if that voice becomes a dominant theme in the child's life, it is then no wonder why that child goes out into the world not knowing who they are, looking to peers to define them, being susceptible to peer pressure. And then later on in partnerships, and profoundly when they have children, they look to their children to define them. They look to their children for acceptance, for unconditional love. They look to their children for aspects that they should have gained ideally in childhood from their parents. They ask their children to do things for them. So context shape us. That's how human beings are built. How you were treated, how you were thought of, how your parents felt around you, all have dramatic impact on shaping you. And you become hardwired, right? All of us are difficult to live with. And all of us are a blessing to live with at times too. We are both things. But when we go back to old places, when we experience a holiday season, when something mostly unconsciously reminds us of old messages, of old energies, of old rules and roles, we will regress to a simpler, older way of coping. I can feel it when I get around my family of origin. I can see it in my wife when she gets around her family of origin. I see her, she sees me doing the same kinds of things. Friedrich Nietzsche said, when we are tired, we are attacked by ideas that we conquered long ago. Regression can happen when we are depleted or when we come into contact with old dynamic and energies. I say energies because it's messages, it's subtle. I was thinking about this leading up to tonight. The human psyche, human behavior is so complex. I remember when I was younger, my therapist used to share with me all the time this childlike energy about how much she was learning. Would often come to our sessions sharing the one thing she learned or read about this week. And she's some 30 years older than I am, and I was always wondering, she's so advanced in her education, how can she still be so enthusiastically and often learning so much? How can she be gaining so much? And it's because there's so much to learn for us. And I'm beginning to have a sense of what that feels like for her. If there is anything I could say tonight, and I'll probably say this more than once, but I'll start with this one that would make a difference in your life, I would be to say, be humble about what you know about yourself for all of us. And if you're not humble, you will inevitably be humiliated. You will inevitably be drawn back at times to an earlier stage of development. We respond to these energies, these messages, these roles and rules with the old ways of coping, with what my wife likes to say, we respond with our mother tongue, our original programming. Any kind of change can spark a regression. Transition of any kind. I've shared the story many times. When I was in middle school, the first project that we were to make in woodshop was a breadboard, right? About the simplest thing you could ask people to make, gluing several pieces of wood together, planing them and sanding them and shaping them. And I remember our teacher, when giving us instruction the first day, broke a breadboard that he had recently made as a demonstration. And if it broke at the seams, he would say to us, he didn't do a good job. He said to us, and if it broke in the middle of the wood, that means he did a good job. Because the transitions, the spaces in between are typically the weakest part. Waking up, going to bed, moving, meeting a new person, traveling, new job, old job, crisis, health issue. Any kind of change can be disruptive and we can regress. And it's just the psyche's attempt to simplify life. Any kind of stress. I like the analogy of juggling. I am a better juggler, metaphorically speaking, than I was 15 years ago. But if you hand me a ball or two extra, I will drop them all. That doesn't mean that I've forgotten how to juggle. It just means I'm juggling more. I'm dealing with more. Probably one of the most common exchanges that I have with clients in psychotherapy, and if you go to psychotherapy, you'll recognize this yourself. The client will come in to give their update about what's going on in their life that day, that week. And often after 5, 10, 15 minutes of sharing stories, I'll just make the simple observation, like, that's a lot. Any one of those events would be stressful, would be difficult. But you're talking about 2, 3, 4, 5 different processes. And of course, you're going to regress back to an earlier stage. In sports psychology, they talk about the idea of what's comfortable If you get a new grip or a new swing or a new technique that your coach gives you, and in practice, you're practicing that and it's new and it feels awkward and foreign, it doesn't quite feel natural. It's very common in a stressful event in a game-like situation, that you'll regress to the old grip, the old way of doing it, the old technique, because it's more comfortable. And we seek in those stressful moments for that port in the storm. Part of it is experimentation. Remember this, folks. Raising children is not about raising good children. I can't emphasize that enough. Raising children is about raising a self, a person. And people aren't just good, they are everything. They're smart and dumb, generous and stingy, wise and ignorant, kind and cruel, skilled and unskilled. We're all those things. That's the idea, the essence of being human. But we get it in our mind out of this pressure, this fear that we have to be good and we have to raise good children. And that's what makes the task of parenting so impossible. Is you want to give them enough room to make mistakes and to experiment, and yet you want to give them the structure to teach and guide them and protect them from themselves. So when you come to somebody like me or a therapist or a parent coach, and you start asking questions about what you should do, it's impossible to answer. I just ask you to keep in line. Remember, it's not about raising a good child. You don't want that. A good child is never the real child. A good child is about being perfect and presenting themselves well. And a good child will have too much shame to see the bad parts of themselves, right? The weak parts, the dumb parts, the parts that people don't celebrate. So life is about experimenting. And when we go back to contexts, to energies, to messages, to relationships, to old relationships that pull us back into that more primitive, older way of operating, we can see, we can learn. We go back and forth. So just like I've been saying the last couple of weeks leading up to the holidays, if you are hosting or if you are going to host, I implore you to consider approaching the time together as a learning experience about yourself and about the family, the context. Just watch. And don't be surprised when you or your spouse or one of your children start acting like a 16-year-old, no matter if they're 30 or 40 or 50 or 60. It happens to all of us. Part of what we have to do is learn the futility of the old ways of coping. That's part of what going back can teach us. It doesn't work again if there's a lot of shame and judgment. If there's not self-compassion, then we just hate the thing. We just hate the behavior. We just cringe when we think about or experience ourselves as more primitive. When we were younger, we were less sophisticated, less nuanced. Things were more black and white to us. We were taught that. And as we grow, we start to embrace gray. We start to embrace not knowing. I think one of my favorite parts of growing older, and there are many wonderful parts of growing older, while there are a couple of significant drawbacks, of course, but one of the greatest things is this freedom that comes from not knowing, not being so absolutely sure and clear. That is death in a spiritual sense. That means that there's no reason for exploration. There's no reason for learning. And part of regression, what it teaches us is that there's still something to learn, that there's still something in there. I remember when I was in treatment as a 16-year-old, against my will, by the way, and I let everybody know. I made them pay for that part of it, my family and the staff. I remember entering a group one afternoon, and the subject of fathers, or my father, came up. I don't know how the subject started. And at this point, at 16, my parents had been divorced for 8-10 years at that point. And my father was becoming less and less involved in my life for more than one reason. Not all of which were his fault, but some of which, and most importantly, his choice to kind of allow it to happen was his fault. But as I started to talk about it, I became overwhelmed with emotion and tearful. I was sobbing in the group. And after spending some time supporting me, we went on to other people and other topics. And by the end of the group, I was back to baseline again. And I can still remember, and I said this to my roommate, walking back to my room and saying, that was amazing. I did not feel that way going into the group, and I don't feel that way now. But I know that that energy that I expressed lives in my body, and it is running the show. And so right now, I'm not experiencing a lot of grief and loss because of the absence of my father growing up. But there are times in my life today when that abandonment, that energy resurfaces. Something in my context currently will trigger or remind me of it, often unconsciously. And I'll be brought back to that simpler, more primitive way of looking at the world and responding to the world. Holidays, family, other triggers. Sometimes we go back and spend time with people in old contexts because we think we owe it to them. There's this thing that we talk about called pathological loyalty. A lot of people that come from really chaotic and abusive families, alcoholic families, addicted families, have this pathological loyalty, this sense that this person or this situation gave me something once in my life, so I owe it to them to show up. And I'm not talking about difficulty in marriage or families where there's opportunities to work. I'm talking about friendships. I'm talking about old relationships that we go back to, even though they don't serve our spiritual growth. They don't support us spiritually. But we do it because we think we should. We do it because that's what a good friend, because you were there for me at an important time. If you grow, if growth is to be a significant part of your life's journey, you will leave old contexts and relationships, not in a heated moment of fight or conflict. You will just naturally outgrow them. And if you get lucky enough to be married to and be in a family where other people have that growth mindset, then you have the gift of growing together. And in a self-examined life, that's the only hope that we have, is that the people around us have the interest in growing and changing and evolving. Because as I always say, if we're the same person today that we were 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, it could be easily argued that we have wasted 10, 15, 20, 30 years of our life. I hope to be a different person. It humbles me to think about the things that I'm talking about and teaching and thinking today, and about how some years from now I will have a different perspective on those things. It can be simply as being tired, hungry, scared, or sick. Anything that depletes us can cause and make us susceptible to regression. Regression is an old, comfortable, familiar way of operating. It's part of recovery. And I think that's really hard for people to hear, that regression is a part of recovery. Because the first thing that people think, especially others, family members, parents, is, well, then it's just an excuse. And it's not an excuse. It's just the truth. I rarely, if ever, have seen somebody make progress on this perfect diagonal line upward. I've never seen that in my life. I get skeptical when people communicate that that's their experience. Regression is going back and testing the old way. It's part of being human. I've told this story many times. It's been years now, where I was working with a father who had his son in our program, had set up a contract. And some months down the road, called me and said, my son is basically violating every single expectation in the contract. And he said, I did it. I know I wasn't supposed to, but I went upstairs after one of the violations and I yelled at him, why are you doing these things you know you're not supposed to do? And I said to him, did you hear it? Did you hear what you just said? You just said to me, you did something that you weren't supposed to do. And you went and yelled at your son and asked him, why are you doing things that you know you're not supposed to do? So I said, now's the opportunity. Go back to your son and tell him you figured it out. Because it's you. Be wary of all or nothing kind of addictive thinking, that failure or regression is a catastrophe. Oftentimes, the individual that's prone to addictive or extreme behaviors does judge things as black or white. Excuse me. They do judge things as black or white. And so one mistake becomes a snowball and a cascade into the abyss. I cannot tell you how many people have said, well, I screwed up the one thing, so I just said, screw it. And I just blew everything up. So we learn to think of things compassionately, to view things compassionately, to view things as gray. Perhaps the greatest gift, I will say this, if not the greatest, tied for the greatest gift of my own participation in therapy is telling my therapist something about myself that I've done, usually regression, and having her shrug, having her be nonchalant about it. And just that response changes it for me. She'll often shrug her shoulders and say, yeah, that happens sometimes. We do that. You do that sometimes. And the lack of fear and anxiety and disaster coming from her, the lack of it settles my nervous system. I'm immediately less judgmental about myself. I have a little bit of forgiveness of myself in that relationship now because of that relationship. And because I have more compassion, now I can work on it. But when I beat myself up, well, I really wish I'd gotten water. I apologize. When I beat myself up, when I judge myself, I'm much less likely to change. It's a part of learning lesson. You know, you have to experiment with the old ways just to make sure that they don't work sometimes. In the addiction world, they call it going back out there. Sometimes somebody will come to a sponsor, to a group and say, you know what? I don't really think I'm an alcoholic. I'm going to go experiment again. Try the experiment again. And there might be some encouragement or some feedback or some warning. But ultimately, the individuals around the person will say, tell us how it works. We'll be here if it doesn't. So we learn things. I love the difference that I've heard people talk about between relapse and flare-ups. Flare-ups are these temporary moments where we regress. And relapse is a full regression. You don't come out of it. You stay in it. You double down on it, right? You fall into the abyss. Your thinking goes sideways and it stays that way. So ideally, we're not going into full relapse, but we're having moments of regression, moments of flare-up. Even during our life, there are times when the lessons and the skills lie dormant. When I left treatment at 17, I did not commit to sobriety, not even for a minute. I tried it for a little bit, actually, even though I never promised that I would or was going to try. I tried it for a little bit, and it went just about exactly how they all predicted it would. And about 6 months later, I was sober. And the miracle of it, the minute I realized that I wanted sobriety, all of the skills, all of the lessons, all of the quotes, all of the ideas, all of the therapy sessions were there. Right there. And nobody had to tell me simple things like you can't go to parties. Nobody had to have that rule for me. I just knew it. Or your old friendships where they're using probably won't work for you. Nobody told me that. Nobody needed to tell me that. I knew it. And it was a loss. It was a grief. It was a real loss. Learning what our triggers are and reassessing how to maintain our progress and support strategies are a part of regression. We learn to choose our family, to choose people. As I've gotten older, I protect my time. I'm only going to be here a little while longer. If everything goes really well, I'm going to have a good 30 or 40 years if everything goes great. Much less time than I've already lived on this earth. And so I'm protective of my time. I don't spend time around people who are cruel or expect me to act the way I did in my 20s or my 30s or my 40s even. Learning to look at your family critically and understand the difference between what is a family value and what is a parent value. You might, mom and dad, have values, but they aren't necessarily your children's. I do not have the same values as my mother and father. I suspect many of you parents do not have the same values as your parents. So why would we want our children to have all of our values? Ideally, we expose them to our values and they buy what they want to buy from us. They don't just swallow it whole. They discern and they're going to experiment. Finding a safe place, finding a safe context is not something we usually do until we're really ready to change. In fact, I have much more sensitivity to safety and non-safety now than I did 10, 15 years ago. And like I said, I'm protective of my time and who earns my time. And that doesn't mean that I'm unforgiving with family and with people that I love in my inner circle. We struggle. We have our struggles. No doubt about it. But beyond that, and in severe cases, I don't negotiate for my safety. I'm not pleading or begging or trying to earn a safe context. I'm requiring it, which means I have to sometimes give up some things, lose some people. Do you go home? Do you not go home? Who do you invite over? Look at those decisions. Look at how you feel. We often live in so many prisons that we don't even know that we live in. I remember I've told this story that my son-in-law, when he was getting ready to be married to my wife, to my daughter, to his wife, in May, we were talking about what he would wear. And at one point I made the joke. I said, he's a super handsome guy. And I said, maybe you should go without a shirt. And I'm like, oh, you can't do that. You can't wear a jacket with no shirt. And then I paused and I said, actually, you can do anything you want. There are no rules. And he ended up wearing this cool backless silk thing that he saw Timothy Chalamet was inspired by one of Timothy Chalamet's red carpet outfits. And it was something I'd never seen before. We live with so many shoulds, so many unconscious obligations, and they hurt us. We live with so many shoulds and so many should nots, and we unconsciously pass those on to our children. Time with family can reveal all of this to us. We can learn to create new rituals and do new things, but we will experience some loss. And in my family, in my circle, the rule generally is that everybody's belief system is honored. Can we co-create rituals or empower our children? Maybe our children have a different belief system. Maybe they want to bring that to a holiday celebration. Are we large enough to incorporate that? Consider changing old rituals that don't make sense anymore. In The Audacity to Be You, I wrote, because children are required to navigate their parents' defenses to survive childhood, they develop in such a way that they end up relating to people who are the same shape, size, and color of their parents, so to speak. In other words, we become shaped by a certain kind of compromised person as we grow, and as we grow up, we are inclined to relate to those same kinds of people. The shape of our wounds predisposes us to fit with others who mirror, in some ways, our original contexts. The work then is to come to know this by unraveling our childhoods, good, bad, and in between, so that we make friends with ourselves. And if we are lucky, we find a partner who's willing to travel a similar path that is their own. Not only we carry our context before us, we look for scenes that unconsciously remind us of our early contexts. The highest human need is attachment. If it wasn't for the attachment between parent and child, we could not survive as a race. We are incredibly vulnerable as children. Our brains are developing significantly until around the age of 25. Significant growth and rewiring from 13 to 25-ish. We are the least capable of being on our own of virtually any species, any animal on Earth. So we have to spend a lot of time with our family. So we become a certain shape, and then we look for puzzle pieces that unconsciously remind us of that attachment experience. So if you had a critical family, a chaotic family, an over-involved, over-identified, enmeshed family, and there are an infinite number of variations, really, you will seek that, not because you're a bad person, but because it is your first attachment experience and your brain feels most comfortable. As my adult children are now getting married, one of the things I want to teach them is to say to them, look, everybody has mental health issues from their family of origin. You do, and so does your partner, your spouse. And not considering that, not taking that seriously is a big deal. And we have this illusion. I have this illusion. I had this illusion with that first story that I shared you about being 16. That I was over it. That I talked about it in therapy. More from the audacity to be you. Compromised people can defeat us now because compromised people defeated us when we were young. Think about that. Compromised people can defeat us now because compromised people defeated us when we were young. Why are we susceptible to narcissistic partners? Why are we susceptible to a borderline presentation? Why are we vulnerable to an alcoholic or to a codependent, to enmeshment, to volatility? Why are we susceptible to these things? Is because they are the thing, the environment in which we were shaped. Like the baby elephant who experiences the futility in breaking free from the trainer's ropes. Even when fully grown at 13 feet high and 14,000 pounds, the elephant is still deterred from attempting to escape by a mere rope around its ankle. We too learn that there is no escape from the captivity of abusive or neglectful relationships. And in my years of therapy, my therapist patiently listened as I complained about abuse and mistreatment from others before I realized that nobody could save me from those contexts except for myself. The situations that I find myself in are a mirror back to me in some way. And of course, I love my therapist. I love therapy. But ultimately, I'm going to have to face the things that terrify me. I'm going to have to walk away from what is comfortable to what is uncomfortable. And under stress, I will regress. And in those moments, I won't often be at my best because it is so terrifying and stressful and anxiety producing. But as I grow and as I change, the people around me change. Not the same people, but the people that are around me are different people. During one really important formative time of my life, right around the age of 40, during one of my midlife crises, I left significantly old contexts. I left old relationships. I told the truth about myself and how I felt and what I wanted and what I believed. And I lost a lot of people. Some surprised me. Some really surprised me. And I gained new people. And some of those surprised me. And I did that because my therapy now was my new base. My therapy was my new place it was the family I never had, the parent that I never had. I would leave therapy each week and regress and come back and be confused because it seemed like I walked away with the insight, the courage, the commitment to change. But the minute as I was exposed to old contexts, to my wife, to my children, to my friends, to my coworkers, I was inclined to behave in my old ways. Your emotional growth and evolution will often expose the emotional immaturity of your parents and others. Don't be surprised. Remember, as you make progress in mental health, you will feel guilty and shameful. You will. You will feel guilty if you're doing good work. Afraid, guilty, and ashamed. It's almost a sign that you're doing well. It's not completely perfect because you can also feel that way when you are regressing, when you are struggling, when you are behaving in old ways. But it is nice to know that as you progress, and your context will mirror this back to you. They will ask you to change back. Even your parents will ask you to change back. Ideally, I would like us to be the observer of ourselves, to be conscious enough to watch ourselves without judgment. Be kind to yourself. Observe your stress level. Consider your expectations. Are they black and white? Are they pass and fail? Are they all or nothing? Watch for your regression. It's going to happen. Everybody listening, if they're listening in some kind of real time relative to the time that I've recorded this, will be gathering with family and friends in old contexts. Watch your regression. Watch your regression. It's very easy to get distracted by your spouse's regression or by your children's regression, but watch your regression. Remember that alcohol consumption lowers one's inhibitions and level of functioning. We regress under the influence, even one or two drinks, even before one would consider oneself drunk. Notice the shame and the guilt. Notices the messages in the family about how everybody needs to believe or think or feel the same way about things. Watch for overdoing it and spending. That might be regression. That might be symbolically you trying to earn your children's love or earn your parents' love, earn someone's love. That might come from the narcissistic wound, which is the conflation of your deeds and your lovability. Can you separate out admiration from love? Can you show up? Are you enough? And again, notice I'm not saying don't do it. Just watch for it. Give yourself and others permission to practice boundaries. I've been sharing this a couple of times today. One of the things I like to share with my clients is if you have a hard conversation with somebody, this is a nice one. If you have a hard conversation with somebody you love and care about, that matters to you, the relationship is worth having a hard conversation. Consider saying this to them. I need to tell you something because you matter to me. I need to tell you how I feel about this thing or a boundary that I want to set. And I want to be clear to you. I'm doing this so I can stay connected to you. I don't think that boundaries are walls. Boundaries are doors that show other people how to stay connected to me. If you front load that with somebody, you improve your chances. But for some people, a boundary or an expressed feeling is so triggering, they'll become totally dysregulated. Watch for that. And remember that self-care is not a sin. Self-care is the beginning, is the starting point for love for other people. The old adage in the Christian scriptures where it says, love thy neighbor as thyself, I've always taught, that's not a commandment. That's not a should. That's just a statement of fact. If we don't love others, we're missing in self-compassion. We're missing in self-love. I love the great quote, the great paradox from Carl Jung. He says we cannot change anything unless we accept it. We cannot change anything unless we accept it. And condemnation does not liberate. It oppresses. The Buddha says that hatred can't cure hatred. Only love can do that. And there are quotes upon quotes that teach this. And the reason there are so many is because most of us are taught, mostly unconsciously, but sometimes consciously, to hate our imperfections, to hate our mistakes, to hate our sins, if you will, instead of having compassion and learning from them. If you have a sin, if you have a habit, a vice, a pattern that you consider negative, maybe consider understanding and listening to it. What's it trying to do for you? What's it defending? What's it protecting? I believe that pathway is much more likely to yield positive results than the results of condemnation and self-judgment and self-criticism. James Hollis, my favorite writer, says, who we have become up to this point is our chief obstacle in life. Who we become up to this point in life is our chief obstacle. Who you are is the thing that you need to kill to become the new you. The thing you need to sacrifice and let go of to become the new you. To come to consciousness, we have to see ourselves more clearly. We must look at our thoughts and beliefs and our background critically. We'll have to let go of things that provide us comfort. We'll have to become someone we don't recognize. The version of yourself today is what you need to survive, is what you needed to survive up to this point. But there is a call to something larger. That's why you're here, why you're listening to me. Perhaps you're here because someone in your life and your close circle is suffering. Whatever the impetus, the call is to a larger life. Perhaps even to a life that you would find unrecognizable today. I've shared this. This is in the journey of the heroic parent. This post of my therapist, I found out years later, had made herself, had drawn herself. The title of it is The Words of Higher Enlightenment. And it's a list of words. Flunk, drop out, fail, stumble, poop out, droop, escape, fizzle, capitulate, weaken, break down, flounder. Words of higher enlightenment. The enlightened person doesn't talk about being enlightened. The enlightened person will most often talk about what a buffoon they are, with playful, childlike humor. The more we evolve, the more we can see our regression, the more we can see our idiocy, the more we can see our faults. I wrote this last week, a thought for developing healthy boundaries with other people in your life. This could be especially applicable during the holiday season, is to assume that every person in your life is not going to change. And then act accordingly. To me, this version of a boundary, this reason, this way of setting a boundary or thinking about a boundary prevents you from trying to change others through your boundaries. Remember, boundaries aren't about changing other people, not even children. Boundaries are about healthy self-care. I parent in a way that I feel good about. And then I turn my children's lives over to them, knowing, full aware that I have dented the hell out of them. I've also provided them with many gifts and wonderful lessons, but I have dented them also. And because of that, they're likely to be angry and hurt. They're likely to struggle in relationships or with self-medicating behaviors. And instead of me getting frustrated, angry, and judgmental about that, maybe I can have compassion for that. But boundary setting is about taking care of me. And the fantastic thing about that is that kind of boundary setting is the most impactful and influential. At the end of the Audacity to Be You, I talked about the keys to enlightenment, and I thought it was a really great reference point in thinking about regression. At the end of the book, I needed the last chapter, and I thought, okay, what's my summary? And among other things, I came up with these, what I thought therapy had taught me. Number one, that we learn to be okay with being wrong, and then we get good at losing. That means that we learn to let go of ego, learn to let go of the need to be right, or to be good, or to win. And that is freedom. That is serenity. There's no battle then. You're not battling your own nature. You're accepting and embracing your own humanness. Number two, come to know your darkness and remain on speaking terms with your mental illness. That's hard language that I use there. Darkness and mental illness. But part of what I'm trying to do is just shock people into realizing everybody has some version of mental illness and mental health, right? We're all on that continuum. Somewhere on that continuum. It's not two piles of mentally ill people and mentally healthy people. It's two opposite ideals, right? The positive ideal and the negative idea. And we fit somewhere on that. And the greatest danger to our mental health, the greatest danger for our regression without our knowing it, is to fool ourselves into believing that we don't have issues with mental illness, that we don't have darkness. I read something today from Carl Jung that said, or from Sigmund Freud, that said that the more perfect a person is on the outside, the more demons they have on the inside. The more put together, the more shiny. This is very common with anorexic patients, right? They try to aspire to this perfect, false idea of perfection external. It's so false that it actually can kill them. But inside there is a rage and a pain and a hurt and a loss. Learn to die again and again is number three. Learn to die again and again. Old contexts, old ideas, old situations, circumstances, and people. In a large sense, therapy is helping people through grief, helping people move from the version of themselves that they are today to a new version, giving up this life. So the take home is be an observer. Learn to slow things down. Watch yourself. Don't judge yourself. And even for the thought experiment, don't necessarily try to improve or fool yourself into believing that you can go home and not regress. Even if it's minuscule, even if it's just a feeling, an urge, watch it, notice it, and discover how much you will see. I like to teach people, act as if the people around you were assigned by a therapist to relapse, to regress, to push you into your old ways of being as a litmus test to see where you are. Again, it's that same idea of assume nobody else is going to change no matter what, and then act accordingly. Try to let go of the expectation of anyone else changing. Try to reduce black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, judgments. Ram Dass says, if you want to be enlightened, judge nothing. Just observe it for what it is. Focus on your response. It's so easy to get distracted by the idiots around us. I've made a profession out of it. But the great work is recognizing the idiot that's looking right back at me from the mirror. Focus on your regression and your relapse, what you can control. Not your child's, not your partner's. One day at a time. Recognizing your triggers and behaviors. Yes, they are nincompoops too. But that doesn't take a genius. Like I always say, when someone comes to me and says, my ex is a narcissist, my ex is a borderline, my ex is an alcoholic, my response is, okay, that's kind of interesting. But what's fascinating is, why did you marry a narcissist or a borderline or an alcoholic? That's the real question. That's the question that has so much life to it. Find other contexts, sit in groups, listen to these podcasts, read these books. What I'm trying to provide with you is a different context, a different way of thinking, so that you can consider new ideas. You don't have to adopt everything that I say, but consider the ideas that you assume are absolutely unassailable, that are beyond reproach, that ought not to be criticized, and look at them again and focus on the journey rather than the destination. All right, folks. Thank you. I hope this was helpful. I like doing it. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon and Audible, like I mentioned earlier. January 15th through 19th in Midway, Utah is our next in-person Finding You workshop. I can't recommend it too much. I believe it's one of the best things that I've ever been a part of and that I can recommend to you. January 24th through 26th is our online option. The Conscious Parenting Workshop is on January 10th. The Masterclass on Attachment-Based Therapy is March 7th. Reach out to us by emailing us at info@findingyouprograms.com or go to our website. My next broadcast will be self-care, gifts for you. That'll be 1 week from tonight, Tuesday, December 10th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. If you want any copies of these slides or any others, info@findingyouprograms.com. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. And I just want to say again, as I always do, thank you for showing up for a process that invites self-reflection, because the people around you will benefit from your self-reflection. For and on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you, I will say, thanks for showing up and thanks for doing your work. It makes all the difference in the world. Have a great evening, and I'll see you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.